This is the talk, as you can see, on elevating your Kanban. And my name is Paul Gower. I want to tell you a little bit about myself to give you some context of the frame that I'm viewing a lot of this information in. So I've been doing software development for quite a long time. I was one of those nerds, I guess you would say, in high school that knew straight out of high school that I was going to go to college. I was going to go full bore into computer science, mathematics minor. Like, I wasn't going to be bothered with anything else. Like, I knew what I wanted to do. I wasn't like, I had friends in college that changed their major and all that. I was like, no. I'm going to go. It's going to be, full-time programmer all the way through and through. And lo and behold, about 7 years ago, so I've been doing software development for a couple decades, so I'm kind of dating myself, obviously. But about 6 or 7 years ago, I really dove in head first into the agile space, lean, Kanban, Scrum, so on and so forth. And as a person who's been an individual contributor on a team, it really resonated with me. And so then I started sharing that with everyone I knew, because I was always that person on the team that would be able to speak some of the business terminology and language for the business side so I could understand their perspective and where they were coming from. But I also understood from the devs, right? Like, we like to work on the new shiny framework or the new shiny thing because it's fun to work on. So I was always the person kind of standing in the fray there. And as I learned about lean and agile, it was just one more thing that I was excited to share with people about as I was working with teams or being a contributor on a team. And so since this talk is talking about elevating Kanban that you may or may not be doing, hopefully you are. If you aren't, that's fine. I'm going to give a real quick summary on what Kanban is. We won't have a whole lot of time to go into all the details here, but I'm happy to talk more afterwards if you have other questions. And so the definition by kanbanguides.org, the quick summaries here is, Kanban is a strategy for optimizing the flow of value through a process that uses a visual pull-based system. Okay, well, what does that mean? And you may not be doing that at work. You may be doing it and not realize you're doing it at work. But there's three main principles when you're dealing with a Kanban system that your team should be doing if you want to fully embrace the benefits of Kanban. And the first is you want to define and visualize your workflow, or a workflow. That's the definition of Kanban. You visualize and define a workflow. Again, we're not going to have time to go into the full details of that, but you want to do those two things with your workflow. Next, you want to make sure that you're actively managing that workflow, and that can take different forms as well. And then last but not least, you always want to be improving the said workflow. So these are kind of the three principles or pillars, if you will, of Kanban based on the free guide. If you want to go read it, it's about 10 pages. It's not super long, but it's it's full of a lot of rich information as you dig in deeper to that. And the biggest central part, if you will, of Kanban, and why it's a little bit different than just mapping out your workflow, is that many workflows are built to optimize value delivery to your customers. Makes sense, right? You're doing this workflow of things to make sure you're delivering value to your customer. The difference is Kanban, it's at its central point, is all about optimizing the flow of your work so that it will actually then deliver that value faster to your customer. So we focus more on flow when you're talking about Kanban, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more throughout the talk today. And so that's kind of the main piece, if you will, in Kanban. And if you've heard people talk about it before, there is this concept of optimizing your flow. But the difference is, instead of fully optimizing purely for efficiency, Kanban is all about looking at the optimization for striving for the right balance, not just on efficiency, but the right balance between effectiveness, efficiency, and predictability, and you're delivering that value to your customer. So again, if you're too heavy set on optimization of the efficiency, your team may not want to work in that environment. So again, we don't have a whole lot of time to go into that in this particular talk today, but that's just kind of the base layer, the groundwork that we'll be building off of today as we talk about Kanban. So I want to tell you a little story about Amanda and Jonathan. So Jonathan is a friend of mine, and he worked for his boss, who was Amanda. And the names have been changed to protect the innocent. But the situation that they were dealing with was really cool. So they were working in a new department at a company that it wasn't really a startup, but they weren't a very, very large company at the time. And so Amanda had started this department, and her and Jonathan had started the interview process to kind of continue to build out their team and grow their team and figure out how to add people to their team. And because Amanda had an extensive amount of experience in hiring people, she and Jonathan had decided that she would kind of have the final approval in that process. And so they would start interviewing people, and then she would be the one that would give the final say of like, thumbs up, yep, let's hire so-and-so, or nope, not right now. And so that was working really well for her and Jonathan as they were starting to build out their team. And then lo and behold, you might imagine, they started growing, as you would expect, right? Because they're hiring people. And so as their business grew more and more, as they were working in this environment with hiring people, they started building out their department. And so now, as you can see here just by this picture alone, they've 4x'd their department, right? So now they have maybe people down here in the blonde hair, maybe her name's Sally, and she's now trying to hire someone else for her team. And so again, the person who has to have the final approval is Amanda at the very top. And so as they had more and more applicants for different roles and positions in their department and the company, especially in their department, it started becoming very, very apparent that they had a problem. And the problem was nothing due to her and what she was doing. It's just Amanda's schedule started getting very, very busy. It was taking longer and longer to get on her schedule to meet with the candidates so that she could finally approve those candidates for the job roles they were trying to fill. And in that sense, what had happened is Amanda had become the bottleneck for their way of getting people in the door to work for their company. And they had this opportunity where they wanted to scale up their business and hire people for their teams, but they were having a really hard time because she started slowing down the growth of the company. Nothing against her per se, she wasn't doing it on purpose, it's just the nature of the situation they were dealing with, scaling up like that. And so, has anyone in here ever experienced a bottleneck similar or just a bottleneck at all in your work? Yeah, I see quite a few hands. Not surprising. And so, we'll come back to Amanda and Jonathan here towards the end of my talk, but another place that I'm sure everyone, if you haven't experienced it in your work, I would be willing to bet that you've experienced this bottleneck in other situations in your life. Right? This kind of gives me a little bit of anxiety when you look at it personally, but that's a whole nother conversation. And so traffic, right? So as you might imagine, as cities grow, they tend to figure out ways or try to work on ways and come up with, I would say, experiments or ideas on how to improve the flow of traffic in the cities, right? Well, in the post-World War II era, it was very popular across America to build freeways. There was a law that went into place that let the federal government cover, I think it was like 90% of the cost was covered by the federal government for interstates and freeways, and then the other 10% was usually picked up by the state. And lo and behold, California actually was leading the way in some of that work around building roads for their larger cities. And so the concept was you would have a lot of congestion in your city, and the way to relieve that pressure or increase the flow of traffic was to add freeways to your city. And so one of these freeways here that we're talking about right now is called the Embarcadero Freeway. So is anyone in here familiar at all with that? I can see a couple hands, that's cool. So you may have a little more context than I do. So from what I understand about the Embarcadero Freeway here is it was built, I think it's late 50s, and it was a freeway that was built, as you can see here, along the coast of the Bay Area in San Francisco. It was covering up this really nice, beautiful, if I can use my little clicker here. This was a historic building in the San Francisco area, and as you can see, people on this side had a hard time even visually seeing that because of the Embarcadero Freeway. But again, it was solving a problem, right? Like they were trying to solve the congestion problem. People were having a hard time. Traffic was starting to get crazy because the city was growing. And so they added this Embarcadero Freeway. And again, it was the thing to do. It was like the norm in America, and it still is today, even in some places. The Chronicle, which was the local newspaper in the area, called the Embarcadero Freeway a hideous monstrosity. Yeah, that's a fair assessment. But again, they were using it as a way to, it was double-decker, they were using it as a way to increase the flow of traffic in the area. And so they were not afraid of the ugliness of it to allow them to solve the problem as like the city organizers or city planners and all that, right? And they'd all been talking to experts about, well, this is exactly the way you do to increase flow. Like, this is the way it works. It's just, we know we see this happening. This is what you should do. It was the way to solve the problem. Well, lo and behold, it was the early 60s. It took a long time to build the freeway. They stopped construction of that freeway, and they had a lot of other plans actually in the city of San Francisco that never came to fruition because they had one of the largest showings of protesters at the time against any more freeways, and for many reasons, right? But they were like, this, even if y'all say this is helping congestion, we don't like it, we don't want to do it. So they actually stopped construction on completing the Embarcadero Freeway. The goal of the Embarcadero Freeway was to connect the Golden State Bridge to the Bay Bridge, I believe, and it never finished. So they stopped it in early 60s. And so you go, okay, well, that's great. We stopped the construction, but now we still have this hideous monstrosity, and it's still helping with traffic, but like, what do we do? Should we remove it? Should we keep it? And at the time, everyone was really concerned if they removed the freeway that they would add all this traffic back into the congestion in the area, right? As you might imagine, that's like a big fear. It's like, we don't want to do that, so we can't get rid of it, but we don't really like it either because it's not helping us make our city look good and like improve property values and all that. So the idea here was they voted, I believe it was in the 80s. Yeah, so 86, they finally got the government to go ahead and put on the ballot in San Francisco area to say, okay, let's vote for it. So again, built in the late 50s, finally in the late 80s, they're putting it on the ballot to remove it. So like 30 years, right? They've been dealing with this. Well, lo and behold, they put it on the ballot, and in 87 when it was voted on, or 86, the primary election, it was voted on, 2-1, they voted against it. Okay, again, they're scared of the increase in traffic and all that. Well, what was really unfortunate but also good at the same time was in 89, getting my dates right here. 89, they had a 7.1 earthquake in the San Francisco area, and it caused many roads, including the Embarcadero, to no longer be in use, right? You might have seen the pictures in different news outlets or whatever at the time, where the Bay Bridge, I think, actually collapsed upon itself, because it was a double-decker, right? So obviously it was unsafe to use, so they shut down the Embarcadero Freeway. And what do you think happened? Do you think the traffic increased or decreased or stayed the same in the city? Stayed the same? Anyone else have any other opinions? Went down?
If the bridge wasn't viable anymore, wouldn't that mean freeway traffic went down?
Well, I'm saying just traffic in general. Did it cause the big influx of congestion of the urban traffic because they didn't have a freeway anymore? Or did it increase, did it, down the same, whatever? We say, someone said down, someone said it stayed the same. Just curious if y'all have any opinions. What do you think? You think it would increase? That's what they thought too. Well, lo and behold, it pretty much stayed the same. Like, there was a bit at the very beginning where it kind of influxed a little bit, but people figured it out, right? They figured out how to get from point A to point B without dealing with all the traffic, whatever that was. And so what they ended up finding out was in 1991, they actually finally voted, because they no longer had the excuse to be afraid of removing the Embarcadero Freeway because of traffic. In 91, so whatever that is, 30 years later, they finally removed the Embarcadero Freeway. And what was funny is, before I looked up and read about this story, I'd been to San Francisco a few years ago, probably 10 years ago, and I'd seen that in the water, but I never knew what the concrete in the water was from. And so now, if you've been in that area too, you may have had the same question I had, and that was why it was there, is because this is where the Embarcadero Freeway was before, And now they've converted it. As you can see, they had trees in the middle area here, a median. They had now a pedestrian traffic area. It was a boulevard, so they didn't get rid of all the traffic, but they didn't have the double decker and the hideous, large structure in the way to cover all the beautiful Bay Area. Property values went up 300%. The views were obviously improved. Another interesting stat here, as we talk a little bit more about traffic, and yes, we're going to get to work, don't worry, is there's a stat that I found that talked about in California, and I'm sure it's in others, but like California had actually tracked this information. When they create a new freeway or street, cities, like not city street, but like more of the freeways, like the larger streets, 95% of the capacity of that new freeway is filled within 5 years of the new freeway created. So they're creating these freeways thinking, hey, we're going to allow people to remove the congestion or whatever, but in less than 5 years, 95% of the capacity of that freeway is filled with traffic. So it's as if the freeways, now they're doing studies to find freeways are actually encouraging people to drive more, therefore causing more traffic. And another case study here is in New York City, the West Side Highway. We won't go into all the details of this story, but you can look it up if you want to. The West Side Highway was a freeway, I think it was called West Side Freeway, sorry. They replaced it with a boulevard later, but when it was created, again, they didn't want to remove it. It was actually even created, I think, before the Embarcadero, because it was in the late 20s, early 30s, and it was created with cobblestone. So eventually it became unusable because a dump truck fell through because they couldn't keep the upkeep of the street, right? And so back to the same situation. They didn't want to remove it. They were afraid of traffic issues if they did remove it, right? So they were trying to do the thing that felt right. The natural thing was, well, it makes sense. You're going to create a road. It's going to create less congestion, right? You're going to add space for people to drive. In fact, what they found was when they removed the West Side Freeway, who wants to guess the percentage of traffic, whether it went up, down, sideways, or the same? Throw some numbers. 0%. It stayed the same. No increase, no decrease. What do you think? This is where you can talk if you want to. Stay the same? 1% up or down? Up? Okay.
I'm going to say
Foot traffic increase? Okay. Well, it did. So it actually went down over 53%. Now, what's interesting here is the stat is not just traffic went down, but the traffic on the freeway, when they were tracking it at the time, 53% of that traffic never returned to the streets of New York City.
Because they're going to take the other route.
Or they're just gonna, they're gonna find other ways to get and to transmit, like, because you think about it, right? If you create a freeway, people are gonna go the path of least resistance, right? So if the path of least resistance is to get in my car and go somewhere, I'm gonna do that. But if you don't create freeways, there's actually a study that I found that I haven't put in my talk yet because I found it just the other day, when a friend of mine shared it with me at my last conference I spoke about this, where they said that there are actually studies now from like 2009 and 2010 where scientists are looking at removing lanes in your freeways to better help with your traffic, because you're adding a lane actually increases people and encourages people to travel more, right? So again, you're adding these things to your way you flow traffic, thinking you're making it better, but you're actually making it worse. I promise we're going to tie this into work. I know we're not talking about traffic today. And so you may be asking, what the heck does traffic do with our work? Well, that's where I want to talk a little bit today about flow, like we talked about at the beginning, right? Kanban's focus is on flow, how the flow of your work is going through your system. And I want to challenge you today because I know for me, my natural instincts and how I'm helping teams get better at doing their work sometimes are not the right ways to go about helping them increase their flow of the work through your work system, okay? And so I'm assuming, but I'll ask first, has anyone here ever experienced a state of flow where you're like, putting them up and knocking them down, right? Like you're setting up the things you're doing and you're just knocking it out of the park. Like you're just in that state of flow is what people have referred to before. I see some hands raising and head nodding. Yeah. So that's a great place to be, right? That's like when you don't even feel like you're working, you're just like floating along, right? This is amazing. And so that's where I want to help you think about as your teams are organizing how they're doing their work and their workflow to remove some things to help you get better at that flow, of the state of flow, if you will. So real quick though, I do want to just share, I think I messed up did I mess it up? I did. Now we're going to see how I can do it with my mouse. So this is the definition of the gentleman, and I cannot pronounce his last name, I'm not going to try, that he was the first psychologist in the 60s to come up with this term around flow, right? And so his definition, which is really cool, it's a psychological term that he started with, right? But we've applied it to our work today because it is that mindset that we get into when we're in that state of flow, right? And so it's, as you can see here, it's a highly focused mental state conducive to productivity. And so this is where I want to share with you from another team that I've worked with recently on how they are doing their flow in their workflow here. So as you can see here, I don't know if you can read that from the back, but hopefully you can. But it's basically, these are the stages of their work that they have. And so they have, I didn't show the first part here would be like their backlog or whatever, where they're letting work kind of pile up a little bit to pull into their system. But this is where they've defined their workflow of the workflow begins on this column and ends once it's merged. Okay, so that's kind of where they track their cycle time. And so as you can see here, they start with building in progress, then they go and put it in building complete. And the two columns together, they have a WIP defined for those columns in that space, right? And so you may have seen this on other boards or other things you've worked with. Like sometimes other Kanban boards I've worked with, they don't have the separate column for when things are complete. The color of the card changes. If you're using Jira, you can do some of those fancier things. We're not using Jira here, but that's some things you can do. So you won't have to have as many columns if you're doing some of those things to visualize how your work is ready to be pulled next. But instead of visually doing it, we do it with another column. That's kind of the idea here. And so I want to show you some numbers here about this team. So this is a summary, as you can see. I wanted to just see where and how this sits with you, if you see anything that's kind of obvious about how this work is being done. But I'll say, to start with, you can see here it's about a 38-day window into the time of them doing their work. This is, unfortunately, an average, so we can talk offline about the flaw of averages if you want to, but it's not ideal to use averages. But in this state, it's good to give you just kind of like wetting your finger and putting in the air to kind of get you a gauge of like how things are going, if things are looking okay, like what you can kind of dig into a little bit more as your team is getting work done here. And so here on the, I totally messed up my whole thing. Okay. Anyways, so here on the side over here, this column are averages, okay? And so you can see here their total average was 9 days. So when they get a ticket in their system, it takes them about 9 days to complete that ticket. And then each stage is those averages as they go through there. And so as you can see here, this is the part that I wanted to talk about a little bit more. And does anything strike you as a little bit odd about some of those numbers? Is anything, if you want to put your lean or Kanban hat on and have a little head tilt for some observations here that may go, huh, that's interesting. Just curious. If not, we're going to get to it. But
does that mean that it spends 3 days with code review complete before it gets to validation?
it does.
Building complete is longer to get.
So the first one I'll just repeat for the video was, does it take 3+ days in code review complete before it gets to validation? And I was like, yes, that is the case. What were you saying over here?
And building complete seems higher too.
And building complete seems higher as well. Yep. So that's where I want to get into what I refer to as handoffs. So when I'm talking about a handoff, it's literally the time when someone on the team has stopped their work and they're putting it into place for someone else to pick it up, right? Just like the picture shows, right? Like if you're running a marathon, or not marathon, if you're I'm escaping the field,
Relay.
Yeah, relay, there we go. So if you're doing a relay, right, you're handing the baton to the other teammate as they continue on the path with the relay to finish the race. As you can tell, I'm not a runner, sorry. But at any rate, this is kind of where if you start looking at your system and how your team is getting work done, I want you to keep an eye out for those handoffs. For those handoffs that I would espouse are going to turn into bottlenecks, right? So keeping an eye out those, you'll see. And so if we go back to the picture here, y'all picked them up right off the bat. You're a real smart crowd here today. So as you can see here, this is one of the handoffs that we're dealing with. And I would agree, it's very odd to me that if the total time was 9 days, but if we didn't, I didn't highlight these, but like if you see building in progress is about 2 days. And then if you just figure in validation, it's about a day. So you're saying for a 9-day ticket, it took about 3 days of hands on keyboard per se. Seems kind of a bad, like an off ratio. Not bad, but just an off ratio. It's something to go, huh, that's interesting. What experiment could we run to maybe help alleviate some of that? And so again, here you'll see the other handoff as code review complete.
Nobody ever sent it to merge?
So does no one ever send it into merge? So merge is when it's finished, right? So you're only going to have an arrival rate of merge. The other cycle time only happens when it leaves, right? So it's going to be, when it starts and when it ends is when when it begins in the column and leaves is the cycle time, right? All right, so this is where if you would like to use your phone, you can. I've been using this new Slido, which is a little bit more interactive if you want to, if you don't feel like raising your hand and saying it out loud here. But I'm just curious, what handoffs have you seen in your process? Would you be willing to share some examples and just curious to see if y'all have seen those in your experience? And you can raise your hand and talk, or you can put it up here and we can talk about it, whatever y'all, yeah.
So I work in a healthcare organization, so it's network-based, but part of our problem is the systems that we use to credential and contracting. So you have to contract people, you have to credential people. The handoffs, both parts have to be done before somebody's done, right?
Okay.
Which one you do first, different networks have different theories.
Sure.
But they're typically completely different systems, and then they want to track their cycle time. So, and your contracting is under one set of management, credentialing is under another set of management, so they're worried about their cycle time, but then when they have to communicate, this is done,
Right.
and off, now we have to go to a different system, a different way, and it just ends up a bottleneck of a person who has to enter it into the next system and triage it out. So
Right.
that's where you're
Bottleneck, yeah, because especially if so are you dealing with contractors and full-time employees, or you call them credentialed? Or is it?
Contracts, like they write contracts.
Oh, like
So
a
they
write,
have
okay.
contractors, but not
Yeah, yeah.
a contract employee, like they write contracts.
Okay, so they're writing a contract and then it has to go through some sort of approval and then it gets to be an actual contract.
Correct.
Is that kind of, okay. And so like the delineation would be, they've written the contract, now it has to be, I'm assuming, approved or some sort of a process between
Well,
the two?
In healthcare, if I read a contract with a doctor.
Gotcha.
I then have to verify everything he's told me is, like, he has his license, he has a specialty, he hasn't had a felony.
Right. So so the first part would be figuring out and writing up the proposal or the contract for the person, and then you have to verify on the back end to make sure it's all credentialed and everything is legit of what has been said.
Right.
So there's a two-part piece there, and you're trying to, yeah, so those would definitely be handoffs, because it sounds like there's two different teams doing that work, right?
And off of two different systems.
Two different
so
systems
they
even.
partially
Mhm.
really communicate.
Right, yeah. That's definitely a handoff, absolutely, right. Yep, dev to QA I'm seeing here, code review, PR approval. Does that be like public relations maybe before something goes out is what I'm guessing?
No.
Pull request, I gotcha. See, I was in the wrong mindset here. Sorry.
All my code goes through public relations.
Yeah, they'll say you got to make sure it's through PR, right? Hey, some people could be in here that aren't writing code. I was trying to be a little, well, cool. Yeah. Code review. Code review is a big one. Requirements review. I can't even talk. Tell me a little bit more about that. How does that work? Does anyone want to share? If you don't, that's fine.
Which one?
The requirements review. Sorry. This one here.
That was trying to materialize
Oh, one second.
what Melissa was saying.
Oh, okay.
Is, requirements don't always go, or requirements development is often not done by developers, but
Gotcha.
when developers get the requirements and this, you know, these are not supported by our system and would mean in future need product approval, or, you know, why are we doing this? Because this is going to cause failures in the future if we do it this way.
Right. So it's a review of those requirements. And so it's a handoff between someone on the business side has done some analysis, and then now they're bringing those to the dev team. And then there maybe is some back and forth there of like, well, this may not work, that may work. We need to figure out this. And so there's that for sure handoff, and then the back and forth even, which makes it even more of a handoff because you're back and forth, right? It's a great example. Cool. Thank you all for sharing. And so I want to talk to you a little bit today. I'm going to keep picking this up and it doesn't work. I want to talk a little bit about how you might be able to remove some of those handoffs. Does anyone here like to look at doing that maybe? Anyone interested in doing that maybe? Okay. Don't have all the answers, but I have some ideas, and hopefully these will be something that you could at least consider going forward. So first, I want to start off with the mindset, which has to be, in my opinion, you have to be curious about how you could solve this problem. So I saw code review up there, even PR was up there too, which I flubbed on obviously. And throughout my career, like I said, I've been doing this a little while, that has been the norm, right? So if anyone even remotely mentions like having your code go to production without code review, you may be taken out back to the woodshed, if you will, right? But I want you to be curious about that, right? Like what would have to be true for you to be able to remove that handoff of code review, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Also, I want you to always be learning. I don't know if you know this or not, but I don't know the exact stat, but I always say at a minimum, you're probably in the top 10 to 15% of the industry because you're here at a conference. So many people in our industry that are doing software, solving problems with technology, maybe not doing explicitly software, but you're in the tech space at some level, otherwise why would you be at Code on the Beach, right? To learn how to solve problems with technology, you're in the top 10%. So continue to foster that, continue to learn. Don't be afraid of learning of how you might be able to do that. And then CrossFit, no, I'm just kidding. It's cross training. So the idea here would be is like, how could you help your teammates learn how to QA so that you could remove some of that bottleneck for QA, right? How could you get more involved earlier in the requirements gathering at your organization? Is that even a possibility? You don't know if you don't ask, right? Like there's no guarantee that it'll work out, because I know there's a lot of companies that have very rigid processes like contracts and things like that where you may not be able to get involved in the process to make it less of a handoff and more of a flow of work. But being curious, always be learning, thinking of other ways to cross-train other members of your team to help them kind of get better at flowing the work through the system are a couple of ideas there that I wanted to share with you. And I want to give, I don't think it's really a silver bullet, although my friends who have taught me about some of this would probably say it is. And it's this idea around collaboration. So who in here may not have ever heard of the term collaboration? Right, I would expect pretty much everyone to have heard of it, right? So I'm not teaching anything new here. However, I think, at least for me in my career, like I said, I've been doing this a while, just about 8 months ago, I was introduced to a different way of collaborating that I hadn't done before. And it's this, back to this definition we had before, right? Of like a highly focused mental state conducive to productivity. But I would add in this word collective. So has anyone in here ever heard of mob programming? See a few hands. Okay. Yeah. The way I look at it is more of like working in concert together. Having the people who can solve the problem in the room at the time to solve the problem, or in the Zoom call to solve the problem, right? In a remote environment today. And so it's this idea that when we're doing things in concert like this, we can have the person who's doing QA, who has a passion for QA, helping the devs do the QA part. Maybe even having the dev help the QA person write an automated test that the QA may not have been able to do. Or as you're doing the requirements gathering, you're able to be involved in the process to let it be less of a handoff, where you're actually involved earlier and more often in that process to know the requirement that they said over here wouldn't work, but you knew it earlier in the process, right? You're working in tandem in that mindset. And again, that's why I go back to the curiosity, the always be learning, and the cross training is maybe you can't do the full-blown mobbing setup where your entire team is working together in a Zoom call for 6 hours a day every day, because that just doesn't work in your environment. But like, what could you do to learn from some of these pieces around removing those handoffs that you would have thought, well, we can't remove code review. Like, we can't not code review, Paul. How do we ever do that? But being curious to ask that question, I want to challenge you today to think about that, because there is some value in some of this. Very similar to what we talked about with the freeway, right? They were just dead set for over 30 years. We can't remove this. It's going to just cause craziness. We can't do that. And they finally did, and it worked out okay. They're also finding studies today that it's the right way to do traffic, that urban grid systems are actually better at handling the traffic in an urban area versus a freeway going and splitting the city in half. But we won't go off there. I've already talked about traffic too much. But as you can see here, so this was the original board we talked about with a team I was working with. And then we talked about some of the statistics here, right, where they had some, like we talked about, literally 3 days. Okay, let's go ahead and do 4 to give you the code review, right? So let's say you do it 4 days. That's still less than half of the time it took your team to get that done, right? If you could just cut out some of that waste. If they could do it in tandem as a collaboration. The idea where you're able to at least just shift the mindset of your team to not have the handoff, but like, we're not going to start something else till this thing we're working on is done. And I know it's not an easy sell to management sometimes, because they may see it as, well, we're wasting 3 other people's time because all 4 of you are working on this one thing. But I would argue that the 4 people working on that one thing, you're upping the amount of changes that happen to the team for the lottery to come in and steal away enough of your team to where you can't continue to deliver value to your customer, right? You may have heard of the lottery ticket versus being hit by a bus. I like that one better than the bus one. But it's how many people on your team would have to win the lottery for you to be able to continually still deliver value? Would it just be one? Does it take literally one person winning the lottery for your team to just crumble and not be able to deliver value? What if it took 4 or 5 because y'all are working in tandem at the same time on the effort, and so y'all can work together and get it done, right? So Paul's out this week, it's okay, we're still delivering value to our customer, right? You're building a resilient team. So that mindset. And so if you take what we talked about here, right, and we split it down to something like this, let's say this was your Kanban board. What do y'all think about that? Is that scary? Does that sound like something you could just, yes? It is, right? It's a different way. It's a very different way.
I love that.
Yeah. Depends on where you are in the process, right? You might love that.
That's a get shit done thing right there.
Right. Yeah. And so as you're thinking about, because I'm a big fan, so Kanban, and this is something I didn't say earlier and I meant to, Kanban is all about, and that's what I love about it, it's all about meeting you where you are, right? And you may have heard that on different agile practices or whatever. I'm all about that. I do not by any means want to prescribe, come in and upend the apple cart and change everything today. But if you have kind of this picture in your mind of here's where we could go, where, holy cow, you're saying, Paul, that we could have a workflow in our system of building software and not have a PR approval or a code review or a QA handoff? Wait, that's crazy town. I mean, you can't do that, right? But I want to encourage you to think about there are ways to get there, right? If you think about it, the PR process from GitHub was built by GitHub because it's a great way for a single contributor to get feedback on something that they did by themselves. But if you flip the script and say, well, we don't care about the individual contributor as much as a team, how we did, asynchronous PR review isn't as valuable. When are you doing your PR review? When are you doing your code review? The best time or the worst time? You may kind of get, it's the worst time. The worst time to do the code review is when it's already done, right? To your point earlier, we did requirements and now we handed it to the devs and oh crap, we forgot that we can't do that thing over here because of the, well, if the dev had been involved earlier, who would have helped with that? Well, hopefully the dev, right? Like, again, we all make mistakes. In the same way, which we won't go off on this trail too long, but estimation. When do you estimate? Best time, worst time?
For me, you already had beers tonight.
It's the worst time, right? I don't want to go off too far on the whole no estimate idea there, but I'm just saying, like, if you think about it, you're trying to estimate how long something's going to take when you know the least about it, right? Again, that's a whole other talk. We aren't going to do that. But the same thing with code review, right? And that's where I want to encourage you to think about. I'm not saying tomorrow you can just rip out code reviews because your boss would probably not be happy, but I'm just saying having the conversation, right? Being creative, thinking outside the box. Maybe you could even mob. I'm not saying you can, but maybe you can, right? There's some opportunity here to really improve the value delivery from your teams and the way you're getting work done. It's that mindset shift, right? Because with the freeways, back to that, it's, oh, it just has to happen that way, right? Like that's just the way it goes. Why can't we do that? And so, let's see, are we doing good on time? Is it 5? Am I done at 5:30, right? Okay, so let's do this. I just want to be curious. Does anyone have any handoffs that they may have removed in their work before? Or is this like a totally new concept? Because I don't think I'm that smart. I think other people have done this. And again, if you don't want to do it on this, you could raise your hand, whatever you prefer. But yeah, have you ever removed a handoff? Or it could have been an approval. That's another way to say it, right? Some sort of something in your process.
Can't necessarily say remove it, but usually that PR process falls down because the PR is too big.
Yeah.
Right? If you have this massive amount of code and then you're handing it off to somebody else to review that code, then they have to relearn the context of what you're doing there and then look through 78 files.
And usually it's a senior dev that we don't have a lot of senior devs, and so we're taking the senior dev away from something they need to be working on.
Right.
So
basically, if I could restate what you're saying here is, in your experience with the PR review process, oftentimes it's a very large PR.
right, so don't do that,
right?
What we've done
Okay.
is the concept of a large PR is still going to get there, but you take very, very small bites at it. You do a piece of it that can be instantly reviewed.
Okay.
Add that to a larger thing, and that can be
Yep. Okay. So taking
not
the
necessarily
PR.
removing it, but reducing the scope of it in order to keep moving it faster.
Okay. So then you would have maybe instead of having one large PR for a particular potential delivery of value, you would make that value delivery into multiple PRs. Okay. That's an option. Okay. And you were saying sometimes when that happens, the senior dev has to review the PR, which can slow things down because they're not doing what they should have been, or not what they should have been. They're off doing this when they need to be doing other things too, right? They can't, you only have so many of those senior devs, right? Of approvers, right? It's interesting, yeah. Swarming. Do you want to give a little bit of context there with swarming? How did y'all swarm? Yeah.
For when I've done swarming was fair bit of production work had to get work on the side on it.
Okay.
They all hands push on a significant rewrite into a secure machine.
Okay.
Everyone dropped work. Everything that didn't have an active client deadline
Gotcha.
for a client customization team got dropped.
Okay.
And full coordination.
Okay. So basically everyone had things they were working on, but due to the issue, they stopped what they were working on to focus on this unless it was a potential client deadline. But anything that wasn't, they were able to shift priorities on, they would come together and swarm on it. Absolutely. That's a good way to get some of that done. Automation, reduce pre-production environments. Some really good stuff here. And I haven't. That's I'm not surprised, right? Like maybe you haven't been able to remove handoffs. So we're going to close this out here, going back to Amanda and Jonathan. So like we were talking about before, right? So Amanda had this great idea working with Jonathan. She was going to help the team out by sharing her expertise to kind of be the person that can help them get the team grow to the capacity they need to be by being the final approval. Lo and behold, of course, like we said already, she turned into the bottleneck. So what happened? Well, in talking with Jonathan, I encouraged him to have a conversation with Amanda and go to her and say, what would have to be true for me to be able to be the final approval for the people that I bring to the table, like going through for my team? And the other people under Amanda had the same idea. And so they went to Amanda, had the conversation, and she was ecstatic. She was like, yes, let's do this. And so the process that she came up with was, she said, bring me 3 more candidates, and if there's no questions I have about the candidates because you've done your due diligence or whatever, fantastic, let's just rock and roll. After those 3 candidates, you can just do it on your own, and then I can be removed from that process, right? So that she's not the bottleneck anymore. And so that's exactly what they did. They started doing that. They had the 3 come to her, and they were able to get back into that state of flow in their hiring process. And again, back to what we were saying before, right? Around traffic, around your work environments, everything comes back to helping your team figure out how to get into that state of flow. Like we all said, like I saw almost everyone in the room, if not everyone, raise their hand with a smile on their face when I said, have you ever been in a state of flow? Right? And it's a great place to be. So how can we remove those impediments that are obviously going to keep us from being in that state of flow? And so what I want to challenge you with today is, as we leave here, is from the great Michelangelo. So Michelangelo was asked by the Pope how he created the David. It's like, how did you create that amazing sculpture? And Michelangelo's response was, he didn't create it, he just removed the things that were not David. And so as you go back to your jobs, go back to work, think about the things that you can remove so that your team can get back into that state of flow and do those things that, like, instead of doing the things you're currently doing that may not be necessary. And again, PRs may be necessary. Code review may be necessary. Maybe there's a way to make it better. Maybe there's a way to remove it altogether. Regardless, what can you remove from your process? Because often we always want to add things. Who in here has ever worked at a place where they had a process to remove approvals? Yeah, everybody's laughing because I haven't either. But how many of you here has worked at a place where you had a process to add an approval? Say production goes down, right? Like, heck yeah. So the next time you have to add a handoff or an approval, ask the question, okay, let's do this for now. What would have to be true for us to be able to remove this in the future? Oh, well, the team would need to level up and do this. Great, let's do that. Let's have a plan to remove it versus just adding it. Because just like with code, dead code is around all over. Don't add it unless you have a way to remove it later so that the team can get back to a flow, right? It's a bump in the road, right? Maybe they're not senior enough to be able to do some of the things they need to do. Great, give them the space to learn and grow and do that, and then have a plan for how you can remove some of those things in your process. Because oftentimes, we always want to add those columns to do things in our process, and yeah, it cannot always work out the best. Yes, and questions?
So, I love that you're saying remove PR or remove code review. At the same time, for industries that have either audit or additional, if there's a lot of various external from the software development process requirements that, code release is independent, things for sleeping, but making sure that you have additional checks. What's your recommendation to get the administrative shape in the box, maintain SOX compliance or those types of compliance, and remove code review?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I could restate what you were saying, was there are some industries that require either an external review of your code or some sort of external approval process that's out of the hands of the devs, right? For Sarbanes-Oxley, it's one of the things that was put in place, right, with the Enron stuff. where you can't just ship code. The code has to be externally reviewed by another team that wasn't able to touch the code so that you're all checks and balances in place. And so, that's where I would, again, I don't know everyone's context. I would just ask the question of what would have to be true for this to go away. And the answer may be legally we can't, or you know what, this is the way that we could do it, asynchronously possibly. I mean, I'm just thinking out, again, being curious, thinking outside the box possibly from there. But at a minimum, I would definitely have those pieces in your flow of your Kanban to be able to track some of that cycle time, because that way you can actually talk to management about, hey, our team is, whatever we had before, right? Like 3 days of actual work for 9 days of work. This is what's happening, and we're okay doing that, but it's not ideal. Like, we don't feel like we're accomplishing as much, because when you're not in a state of flow, I didn't ask that question, but when you are not in a state of flow, how do you feel at work? Right? You don't feel like you got anything done that day. You're feeling like, I didn't contribute as much as I could, or it wasn't as ideal of a scenario, right? And so that's something that I would ask from the standpoint of, like, in that particular context, maybe there's an option to, flip the script a little bit from the standpoint of Sarbanes-Oxley. And I haven't worked in an environment with Sarbanes-Oxley in a while, but I'm just saying, like, are there new laws in place that you can get by doing X, Y, and Z versus the full, this is the way we've always done it, freeways are the way to go, right? That's how it helps with traffic congestion. Like, maybe there's some other ideas around how to shift that. Right, absolutely. Why are we doing that? Paul in the back real quick first. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have a suggestion that I was going to put forward, which is an answer to that. Which is one thing you can look at doing is post-hoc reviews. So one of the problems with PR reviews interrupting flow is that typically happens between dev on your local machine and some sort of integration environment, right?
Yep.
QA, some tests, something like that. If you flip that to where you're saying, to where you only really need to review it in most cases before it gets into production or further into other environments, you can actually integrate early, get a validation on your work early, and then do the post-hoc review before it gets merged in the master domain or something that's going to be represented.
Yeah, that's a great, so the solution there would be a post-op, you said, like for operations review?
Post-hoc.
Post-hoc review. And so a way to review it after the code is right, like you said, that's a way to do it as well. Yeah, is after the fact. So it's right before it goes to production. Because then you've checked the box, but it's maybe even automated, or it's some other solution you can use AI for possibly. I mean, there's lots of options to think about outside the box from, we have to do this because it's always the way we've done it, right? That's where we get into, I mean, we're creatures of habit, right? Like, we like our habits, we like to do our things. I mean, but like, breaking the mold a little bit can be helpful. And you had a question, sir?
It wasn't necessarily a question, it was kind of almost what you were saying.
Okay.
I was talking about, or y'all were talking about reviews. If we could review them a little bit sooner, maybe we could steer the person from going down the road that he wasn't going, so that big PR is not so big anymore, and then we could actually shorten the process if we have incremental reviews. That was something that you had mentioned earlier that I
Yep.
thought that
Right.
probably pretty useful, because it would keep them going in the right direction and maybe answer some questions right up front before we go off and put something that's not going to work later on, and it will get more of a rewrite or a refactor.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, if you have the availability and your manager and your leadership's supporting it, having a group of people that can solve the problem in the room is, to me, the most efficient way to do it, right? And it's weird because you're going, wait, Paul, you're going to have 4 people, that's like 2 or 3 devs, a QA, a designer, this in the room, product person in the room, and they're going to be there doing this whole ticket from soup to nuts, from beginning to end. Yeah, and as they get into a state of flow, it's like speed racing, right? But it takes time. It takes more interpersonal skills, right? Because you might imagine there's no handoff happening. It's like real time. Oh, I don't agree with what you're doing here, but I can't be a jerk. I've got to figure out how to interpersonally communicate and bring up the challenge that we're talking about here to solve the problem at hand that we would find later. Let's do it now, right? There's a lot more interpersonal skills happening. But again, and it sometimes can frustrate devs who've been in that mode of like always behind the keyboard just slinging code. But if you're in a mob or an ensemble, I like to use that term, regardless of what term you use, if you're in a situation where everyone in the room is helping to solve the problem, your days are not 95% slinging code. You're maybe 5% slinging code. And I've said for years, even before I learned about mobbing, if it was a typing problem, we would just send the devs to typing school, right? The problems are never the fact that we didn't have enough time behind the keyboard. It's usually like the thinking part. It's the problem solving. It's talking with the business. It's talking about requirements. It's doing the earlier code review with somebody who knows a little bit more about the context. Like, those are all the things that are solved when you are with the right people in the room solving the problem. Another great author I like is Marty Kagan. If you're into product management at all, Marty Kagan talks a lot about this. He uses a different term. He uses empowered product teams, right? So, and he doesn't really like espouse necessarily like everyone's in the room doing the thing at the same time, but like obviously that would be the highest fidelity way to do it, right? Is your product person, your devs, everyone's discovering at the same time, the UX person, like they're all doing this at the same time. I mean, when was the last time as a developer you had a customer interview with your customer about the product you're building, right? That's not the normal, but like if you're doing that, then the devs can see like, oh, the customer is clicking on this thing over here. I would have never thought to do that because like the way they see it, right? Versus the way the customer sees it. There's so much value in getting that involved earlier and more often if possible. Again, within reason where your company can do, but those are the things that I'm thinking of as far as thinking outside the box. Yeah, another question.
I mean, like, all the things you said, like, the handoffs are there, the 6-panel Kanban board is there, but that doesn't mean that you have to have the visuals that handoffs, right? To get to that 3-column just means that you're still going through all the same things, just rethinking how you're going through it. Like, I keep going back to your estimation thing. It's like estimation, dev, and PR review is the worst way to work possible, right? Because you're always doing thing handoffs and contracts. But like, estimations always drive me crazy because the product manager shows up with the least amount of information possible, telling you to estimate it so that they can just check off that box.
Right.
And then they're like, well, we'll re-estimate that again later. Like, that never happens.
Right.
Right? You know, and then, but like, if you work estimation process into a decomposition process of getting into smaller pieces from which you can actually estimate things, now you know what the hell you're building. That turns into a dev process, and then like everybody use GitHub, and then like draft PRs, like integrating draft PRs into your development process to get that feedback super early into smaller chunks. That final PR is usually like I've seen 90% of this, go, and then your stuff's out the door.
I'd like to give you a counterexample from a team that's successful. My team does estimation 3 times a week for now. But we have a hard rule that if we have questions on the requirements, we don't provide an estimate. Or not quite a hard rule, more. Will some, it depends on whether or not it can affect scope, but our product managers invited to that meeting and they were very, very, very attending or required. So our estimates go back to the business after they've answered all the questions.
Sure, so you've done a full tech estimate review prior to the actual review process. I totally agree. That's something. A couple of my teams do the same thing.
So,
Yeah.
I kind of have a question. I've seen this like happen so many times where a new team starts up with a board and it's got the 3 columns, and that's how we want to start. Yes, we're going to do that. But then it's this a lot of noisy communication of Slack messages. Oh, this is ready for testing, and then you got to, oh, did you see it's ready? Oh, there's a defect. So it gets really noisy and hard to keep track of behind the scenes. Do you have any? And then eventually they're like, well, we'll add a testing column. Well, we need to add another column, and then now you have like 8 columns.
We're getting ready to add another.
All of a sudden.
Right. Yeah.
This isn't testing and pause. This is dev pause. You know, and it's like they always start with the 3, and
Sure.
then that doesn't work. So where's the breakdown there?
Yeah, I've used that example before as well, where you start with a team and you always, like, I oftentimes, if they don't have a process defined, will do to do, doing, done, like you're saying, right? Like you start with those. Back to what I was saying earlier, so how do you keep them from not going off the rails, but like expanding their process to include things that may not be helpful to flow.
Right.
And what I would recommend is every time you add a new column is ask the question, like, why are we adding this? What's the purpose? Is it going to help us flow work through here? Like, what's the goal, right? And so if the goal is to continue to encourage collaboration, it may not make sense to add another column because, like you saw in the data earlier, right, where it sat in a column for like 3 days on average when it was, done in 3 days. So like, why did it sit in the column for 3 days when it was done? And it wasn't like people are maliciously not doing it. They'll forget about it. There's context switching happening. Like the idea here about splitting a PR into smaller pieces. The first thing in my mind when I hear that is flags go off in my mind of like, that's a lot of context switching, right? We didn't have a lot of time to talk about that, but context switching is the death of just like flow, right? Like you're stopping yourself from being able to do that as well. And so those are some things to think about. Again, not that anything's wrong with doing the PR the way he recommended it, but that's where my mind goes, is immediately to the point of how is this going to impact flow? Because again, the definition of Kanban is define and visualize the workflow, actively manage the workflow, and then how are you constantly improving the workflow? So run an experiment. Maybe the next time you do that and your team starts with 3 columns, before they add the 4th column, say, what if we did it a different way? Like instead of adding the column, what is the purpose of this and how can we do it a little differently?
Right. I guess I'm just curious because, I'm a QA manager. I've seen value from having a 10 column that can go back and forth. But then after that, like you made that one extra column and then everyone else goes crazy. So like, how do we reel it back in? And is there actually a technique for keeping testing and
Right. I mean, that's where, like at our company right now, what we're doing is we're shifting everything left as much as we can. So with the mindset of DevOps, shifting left, right? And so instead of having a QA column, embedding a QA person on the team could be another way to do it. And then immediately the first question is, well, Paul, that QA person isn't fully utilized the whole time. That's right. You're thinking about it from, in my opinion, the wrong frame. The frame of my resources need to be busy all the time, which we didn't get to get into today necessarily. But instead of worrying about the people, resources, whatever you want to call them, being busy all day, we're creating space for the work to flow through the team, right? Versus worrying about everybody being busy all the day. And what could the QA person do with the dev? Like maybe they sit with the dev and work on work with the problem and just be a rubber duck sometimes to talk with the dev to hear what's going on, right? Like there's lots of opportunity there. Again, if the team is open to it, right? Because I'm a big fan of like, they have to be open to it. I wouldn't force it on anybody, but if they're open to it, I would highly encourage it because you're gonna see a lot more value out of that. Yes?
As a QA, I second that 100%. I love buddy coding with my devs. We'll get on a call. I'll spend hours with him there. I test it while he works on it, and it is an amazing work.
That's so
Yeah,
cool.
we were talking about
Yeah,
that.
I've seen that.
Because you're in a state of flow, right? And you could even step away and be like, okay, you keep doing that. I'm going to go over and ping it a little bit over here on this where you go do that. And then it's just back and forth right there. Absolutely.
And sometimes we get our PM on the call, and I didn't even know we were mob coding it, but
Yep.
it works really well. It's not a really policy. It's just on occasion we have a problem, we want to do it, and we really get some work done.
Yep.
That's a really cool state of flow.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you for coming. Don't forget there's stickers up here. I'd love to connect with you if you have more questions or if I can help out in any way. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Yeah.